It was just another busy day at a large company. Employees were working hard, answering emails, attending meetings, and chatting in the break rooms. The office was filled with the usual of productivity. At one of the desks sat a black woman, Sarah, who had been with the company for 5 years. She was skilled, professional, and always dedicated to her job. She had worked hard to climb the corporate ladder and was well respected by her colleagues. But today, things were about to take a shocking turn. Sarah's manager, Mr. Smith, had never been particularly friendly. He wasn't a fan of Sarah's confident attitude, her work ethic, or the way she carried herself in the office. Over the years, he had made small, offhand comments about her appearance and her style, but Sarah had always brushed them off, focusing on her job. But this time, things were different. It all started with a minor mistake. Sarah was running late for an important meeting, and in her rush, she accidentally misplaced some paperwork. It was a small mistake, something that could be easily fixed. But Mr. Smith wasn't having it. He walked over to Sarah's desk, his face red with anger. He seemed to be looking for an excuse to lash out. "You've messed up, Sarah," he said harshly, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've been slipping for weeks now. This is unacceptable." Sarah looked up from her desk, surprised. She had been working tirelessly, putting in extra hours, and this was the first time she had ever made a mistake like this. She tried to explain, "I'm sorry, Mr. Smith, I'm just a bit behind, but I'll fix it immediately. It won't happen again." But Mr. Smith wasn't listening. Instead of hearing her out, he cut her off with a sharp, dismissive tone. "I've had enough of your excuses. You're fired." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Fired? She was stunned. "What? You're firing me over a minor mistake?" "Don't act like you didn't deserve it," Mr. Smith snapped. "You're just not cut out for this job. Maybe you're better off somewhere else." Sarah felt a mix of anger and disbelief rising in her chest. She had worked harder than anyone else in the office, and this was how she was treated. The thought of being fired over something so small and being spoken to like this stung deeply. She could feel her heart pounding, but she kept her composure. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mr. Smith," she said, calmly, standing up from her chair, "but I don't think this is fair." The office was silent. All her colleagues were watching, but no one said a word. They were all too afraid to speak up, to stand against Mr. Smith. Sarah knew this was how it always went. The people in power could do whatever they wanted, and no one dared to challenge them. But Sarah wasn't afraid. She was tired of being overlooked, tired of being dismissed. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I don't need to stay in a place where I'm not wanted," she said quietly, but with strength in her voice. "You won't be hearing from me again." With that, Sarah calmly walked out of the office, leaving everyone in stunned silence. The look on her face was one of determination, but also disappointment. She had just been fired for no reason other than the manager's unfair assumptions about her. She didn't let him see her upset. Instead, she held her head high as she walked out of the building. As she left, her colleagues were still speechless. Mr. Smith stood there, fuming with anger, but there was nothing he could do. Sarah had already made her exit, and it was too late. The office buzzed with nervous energy. No one knew what to think. Everyone had seen what happened, but no one said a word. The scene felt like something out of a movie. "What happens next?" one of Sarah's colleagues whispered to another. The cliffhanger hung in the air, unanswered. Would Sarah just accept this and walk away, or would something even more unexpected happen? What would she do next? Would she ever return? The tension lingered, and the answer would come soon enough. But for now, the only thing that was clear was that Sarah was done. And what happened next would leave everyone stunned. Sarah had always been a dedicated and hard-working employee at the company. She was skilled, professional, and committed to her job, working long hours to ensure that everything was perfect. Her colleagues respected her, and she had earned her place in the office. But despite all her hard work, Sarah had faced subtle, often unnoticed racism over the years, particularly from her manager, Mr. Smith. At first, the signs were small: offhand comments, condescending tones, and dismissive gestures. She would often overhear Mr. Smith making jokes with other employees, commenting on her appearance or the way she spoke. At times, it seemed like nothing more than casual remarks. But as time passed, Sarah began to realize there was more to it. She was constantly overlooked for opportunities that her colleagues, who were less qualified, easily received. Mr. Smith seemed to have a special dislike for her, always finding reasons to criticize her work or question her decisions, even though she was one of the most efficient workers in the office. It wasn't just Mr. Smith. There were small microaggressions everywhere. Other employees would give her strange looks when she spoke up in meetings, or they would ignore her ideas, even though they were valid and well thought out. It felt like there was an invisible wall separating her from the rest of the team, and every time she tried to break through, the wall became higher and thicker. Despite all this, Sarah had always remained professional. She never let the comments or actions of others affect her. She kept her head down, focused on her work, and did her best to stay positive. But today, the weight of the years of mistreatment finally came to a breaking point. The incident that led to her firing was a minor disagreement. Sarah had noticed a mistake in one of Mr. Smith's reports, and she pointed it out politely. It wasn't a big deal, just a small oversight, but instead of thanking her for catching the mistake, Mr. Smith snapped at her. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he yelled, his face turning red with anger. "You've been making too many mistakes lately. Maybe you're just not cut out for this position." Sarah was stunned. She had worked with Mr. Smith for years, and this was the first time he had reacted like this. She had always respected him, even if his behavior towards her had been unfair. Now, her heart sank as she realized what was happening. This wasn't about the report. This was about something deeper, something personal. "I'm sorry, Mr. Smith," she said calmly, keeping her voice steady. "I was just trying to help, but if it's an issue, I'll leave it alone." But Mr. Smith wasn't having it. His face twisted in anger. "No, it's not alone. You've been a problem for months now. You're just too much trouble. You're fired." Sarah couldn't believe it. Fired. Just like that, over a mistake that wasn't even hers to make. The words stung. She had always worked so hard for this company, had put in endless hours to ensure everything was perfect. And now, in one moment, everything was being taken away. But instead of arguing or fighting back, Sarah remained calm. She had learned over the years that arguing with people like Mr. Smith would get her nowhere. She took a deep breath and stood up from her desk, trying to steady her emotions. Sarah said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "If that's your decision, I'll leave. But I'm not going to beg for a job that doesn't value me." She walked towards the door without hesitation, her head held high, her back straight. As she passed by her colleagues, she could see the uncomfortable looks on their faces. Some of them even averted their eyes, unwilling to make eye contact with her. Others looked at her in disbelief, as though they couldn't believe what was happening. There was silence in the room. No one spoke up. No one stood up for her. Everyone knew that Sarah was a hard worker, that she didn't deserve this, but they were all too scared to say anything. One employee, a young woman who had always admired Sarah, looked on with tears in her eyes. "This isn't fair," she whispered, but no one answered. Sarah reached the door, her hand on the handle, and before she stepped out, she turned back to look at Mr. Smith. "You'll regret this," she said calmly, her voice steady but filled with quiet strength. With those words, Sarah stepped out of the office and into the hallway, the door closing behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. It felt like the entire office had been frozen in time. As Sarah walked down the hall, she could feel her heart racing. She didn't know what was next, but one thing was clear. She was done. Done with the unfair treatment, done with the assumptions, done with being overlooked. She had tried her best, but this was the final straw. The employees in the office stood there, unsure of what to do. Some were still in shock, trying to process what had just happened. Others exchanged awkward glances, clearly uncomfortable with the injustice they had just witnessed. And then, in the midst of this silence, the camera focused on Mr. Smith. He stood behind his desk, frozen, his mind racing. He had fired a dedicated employee over something so trivial, and now there was no going back. The tension hung in the air, and the unanswered question remained. What would Sarah do next? Would she fight for her job, or would she do something even more unexpected? The office waited, unsure of what the future held. After Sarah calmly walked out of the office, she didn't waste any time. She stepped outside into the cool air, feeling a rush of emotions. She wasn't angry. No, she was disappointed. Disappointed not only with Mr. Smith, but with the whole office. For years, she had put up with his subtle racism and microaggressions, but this was the final straw. Being fired for something so small, so insignificant, was the last thing she expected. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. As much as she had wanted to scream or shout, she knew that wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't help her. It wouldn't help anyone. Instead, she decided it was time to take action. She wasn't just going to walk away without fighting back. Not this time. She got into her car, her mind already racing with ideas. What was her next step? She could try to find another job, but that would only be a temporary solution. She thought about her career, her goals, and everything she had worked so hard for. She had earned every single opportunity that had come her way, yet here she was, being treated like she didn't matter. Sarah thought about the one thing that could give her real power, the company itself. She was done with the small fights, the constant disrespect. She was going to take matters into her own hands. It wasn't enough just to walk away. She needed to make a statement, one that would show not just Mr. Smith, but everyone, that they couldn't treat people like this anymore. She picked up her phone, dialed a number, and waited. It rang a few times before someone on the other end picked up. "Hello, Sarah. What's going on?" the voice on the other line asked. "Mike, I need your help," she said, her voice steady. "I'm done with being treated like this. I want to buy the company." There was a long pause on the other end. Mike, her longtime lawyer, was taken aback. He knew Sarah had always been ambitious, but this was something different. "Are you serious?" he asked. "You want to buy the company?" "Yes," Sarah replied confidently. "I've had enough of being overlooked. It's time to take control." Mike, still a little surprised, began running through the numbers in his head. "This is going to take some serious planning, Sarah, but if anyone can make it happen, it's you. You've got the means to do this, and if you're serious, I can help you with the legal work and making it official." "I'm serious," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. "Let's do it." As Sarah made the arrangements with Mike, she began to feel a sense of relief. She wasn't just going to stand by and let her life be decided for her. She was going to take back control. But as she sat there in her car, her phone in hand, she realized there was still one thing she hadn't fully considered. What was Mr. Smith going to do when he found out? What would the office think when they learned that the very woman he had fired for a small mistake would soon own the entire company? The tension continued to build inside Sarah as she made her way to the bank. The deal would take time to finalize, but she knew this was the right move. She was no longer going to wait for opportunities to come to her. She was going to take them. It was the only way to truly level the playing field. Meanwhile, back in the office, Mr. Smith was sitting at his desk, staring at the papers Sarah had left behind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had fired employees before, but this felt different. Something told him that Sarah wasn't someone who would just walk away quietly. He wondered if he had made a huge mistake. As he thought back to their interaction, he couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. He had assumed the worst about Sarah, and now he was paying the price for it. He had no idea who she really was, what she had accomplished, or how much she had built. He had dismissed her based on his biases, and now it was too late. But the more Mr. Smith thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been. He had misjudged her, not because of what she had done, but because of what he thought she was capable of. He had assumed that because she was a black woman, she didn't belong in a position of power, and now he was going to face the consequences of his actions. Back in her car, Sarah was nearing the final steps of her plan. She had never imagined that a single decision, one as small as firing her, would lead to such a big shift. The company she had worked for, the one that had treated her so unfairly, would soon be under her control, and once it was hers, she would make sure no one would ever have to go through what she did. As she pulled into the parking lot of the bank, her mind was focused on one thing: the future. The future where she was in charge, where she didn't have to deal with prejudice, and where people were treated fairly, no matter their background. As she walked into the bank to finalize the transaction, Sarah felt the weight of everything she had been through finally lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't just walking away from the company she had worked for. She was taking it back. She was going to show Mr. Smith and everyone else that she was far more than they had assumed. Sarah had walked out of the office with her head held high, and the moment she stepped into the cool air outside, she felt a sense of calm. She was not angry, not upset, but resolute. She had been unjustly fired, and she knew that she had to take action, not just for herself, but for anyone who might be in a similar position. While Sarah took the necessary steps to buy the company, the manager, Mr. Smith, sat back in his office, the reality of his actions beginning to settle in. His earlier arrogance had faded, and now he was left with a sinking feeling in his chest. He had fired Sarah, one of his most skilled employees, based on nothing more than assumptions, based on the biases he had allowed to cloud his judgment. Mr. Smith glanced at the pile of paperwork on his desk, unable to focus. His thoughts kept returning to Sarah. He recalled the calm way she had walked out, the dignity she had maintained despite the cruelty of his actions. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't fought back. She had simply left, leaving him to stew in his own guilt. He found himself staring at the door for what felt like hours. The silence in the office was deafening. His mind replayed their interaction over and over again, and slowly he began to realize the full extent of his mistake. He had fired Sarah for something small, a trivial matter, really, and had let his assumptions cloud his judgment. Why had he treated her like that? Why had he not considered who she was, what she had achieved, or how hard she had worked to get where she was? Mr. Smith had been in the business world for years, and yet in that moment he had failed to see the truth. He had failed to treat Sarah with the respect she deserved. She wasn't just an employee. She was a person with value, a person who had worked hard for everything she had. Yet he had thrown her out as though she were disposable. As he sat in his office, guilt and regret gnawed at him. He wasn't used to feeling this way. He had always thought of himself as someone who made logical, fair decisions. But in this case, he had failed to see the bigger picture. It wasn't just about the firing. It was about how he had treated someone based on their race, their background. It was about the assumptions he had made about Sarah simply because she was a black woman. And now he could not deny it. He had been wrong. He finally stood up, his heart heavy. He knew what he had to do. The only way to make things right, even just a little bit, was to admit his mistake and try to make amends. He dialed Sarah's number, the phone ringing once, twice before she picked up. "Hello?" Sarah's voice was calm, but there was a hint of hesitation in it. "Sarah, this is Mr. Smith," he said, his voice surprisingly quiet. "I've been thinking about what happened today, and I want to sincerely apologize. I was wrong to fire you. I made assumptions about you, and I treated you unfairly. You didn't deserve that." There was a long pause before Sarah responded. She was quiet, processing his words, but she didn't speak immediately. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't going to let this apology just wash away everything that had happened. "I appreciate the apology, Mr. Smith," Sarah said after a moment, "but it's not just about the firing. It's about how you treated me. You didn't give me the respect I deserve." Mr. Smith swallowed hard. He had expected her to be angry, maybe even furious, but her words weren't filled with anger. They were calm, and that made him feel even worse. "I know," he admitted. "I should have never treated you like that. I assumed the worst about you because of your race. That's not an excuse, and I can't take back what I did. But I can learn from this." Sarah took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Not an apology for the sake of apology, but an apology that came with the recognition of his mistake. She could tell he meant it, even if it didn't undo the harm he had caused. "Thank you for admitting it," Sarah said softly. "But you need to understand that people deserve respect, no matter what they look like or where they come from. That's something we all have to work on. Respecting each other." The weight of Sarah's words hit Mr. Smith hard. He had spent years in the corporate world, making decisions based on numbers, on outcomes, and yet in this situation, he had made the worst kind of mistake, the kind that hurt someone not because of their work, but because of how they appeared. "I promise you, Sarah," Mr. Smith said, his voice filled with sincerity, "I'm going to do better. I won't make this mistake again. I will treat everyone with the respect they deserve, no matter who they are. I'm sorry for what I did, and I'll do everything I can to make things right." Sarah didn't say anything for a moment. She knew that apologies were only meaningful when they were followed by action. She didn't expect things to change overnight, but she appreciated that Mr. Smith was acknowledging his mistake. "I hope you do," she said quietly, "and I hope others learn from this too." The conversation ended with a sense of quiet understanding. Sarah knew that the road to real change wouldn't be easy, but this was a start. She wasn't just walking away from the situation with her head held high. She was teaching someone a lesson that would impact them forever. As Mr. Smith sat there in his office, reflecting on what had just happened, he knew that this was the kind of moment that would change him. He had learned something important today: to treat others with respect, to never make assumptions based on their race, and to always give people a chance to prove who they are, not based on how they look, but based on their actions. And as he thought about Sarah's words, he realized that it wasn't just about making amends with her. It was about making a promise to himself to change his behavior moving forward. The officer sat in his car, watching as Sarah walked away. The sounds of the city continued around him, but everything felt distant. His mind was full of thoughts, each one more unsettling than the last. The woman he had fired, the woman he had treated unfairly, had just calmly walked out of his life, and it was all his fault. He thought about how quickly he had made his assumptions about her. He had seen a black woman on the street and thought the worst, just because of the way she looked. He had fired her without even considering her dedication, her skills, or her value to the company. He had done something that he wasn't proud of, something that would haunt him for a long time. He had been in law enforcement for years, but this was the first time he had realized how much his own biases had affected his actions. He had seen people as categories: black, white, rich, poor, and not as individuals. He hadn't treated Sarah like a person. He had treated her based on his assumptions. And now, as he sat there, reflecting on everything that had happened, he couldn't help but wonder, how many other people had he treated unfairly because of these assumptions? How many others had felt what Sarah had felt when he made that snap judgment? His thoughts were interrupted by a message on his phone. It was a text from his supervisor asking him to report to the office. The officer took a deep breath before putting the phone down. He knew that this moment, this entire situation, would change him forever. But would it change the way he did his job? Would it change the way he treated people from now on? The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The officer had learned an important lesson that day. It wasn't just about the small mistake of firing Sarah. It was about how deeply ingrained prejudices and assumptions had clouded his judgment for years. It wasn't about an apology. It was about real, lasting change. Meanwhile, Sarah was already starting to move on with her life. She wasn't thinking about the officer or the mistake he had made. Instead, she was thinking about her future, the future of her children, and the importance of standing up for what was right. She had made her point and, in doing so, had found a new sense of strength. As she walked away, Sarah's mind was clear. She had taken a stand and forced the officer to confront his biases. But now, her focus was on the next steps she needed to take to rebuild and continue her journey. She wasn't going to let this incident define her. She had proven her worth, not through anger, but through dignity and resolve. For both Sarah and the officer, the day had ended, but the lessons learned would stay with them for a long time. The officer had vowed to change, to think twice before making assumptions in the future. Sarah, on the other hand, had already moved forward. She had used the incident as a stepping stone, gaining confidence and strength from standing up for herself. As for the company, Sarah's legal team had already started the process of negotiating a settlement. It was clear that they wouldn't stop until justice was served. The officers' actions had consequences, and the company would have to answer for the way they had treated Sarah. The story of the officer and Sarah wasn't just about one encounter. It was about the larger system of bias and unfair treatment that many people face every day. It was a reminder that we all have the power to challenge these injustices and to fight for fairness and equality. The officer looked at the phone again, then back at the empty street. He had made a mistake, but he knew that this was his opportunity to make things right. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was willing to try. He had a lot of work ahead of him, but he had learned that true change begins with taking responsibility for your actions. As the sun began to set, the officer made a silent vow to himself. He wasn't going to let this lesson fade into the background. He would use it to guide his future actions, to ensure that he treated every person with the dignity and respect they deserved. Sarah, meanwhile, had already left the officer behind. She was looking ahead, ready to embrace the future and continue fighting for justice. She knew that even though the day had been tough, it had also been a turning point, a moment of growth and empowerment. The story you've just heard is about standing up for what's right, treating others with respect and challenging the assumptions that can hurt so many people. But now, we want to hear from you. What would you have done in Sarah's position? How would you have reacted if someone treated you unfairly based on assumptions alone? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We believe that every voice counts, and your experiences can help others understand the importance of fairness and equality. Have you ever faced judgment or unfair treatment because of who you are or what you look like? Share your story with us, and let's continue to raise awareness. It's time we stand together and support one another in creating a world where everyone, no matter their race, gender, or background, can feel respected and valued. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. By sharing these types of stories, we can create a stronger movement toward equality. We need more people to join the conversation and make these issues mainstream. Remember, change begins with us. Whether it's speaking out or treating others with kindness and respect, we all have the power to make the world a better place. Your actions, your voice, and your perspective matter. Let's make the difference we want to see in the world. Stay strong, stay respectful, and keep fighting for fairness.